Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Steve Novakovich, Managing Director of Kaya Curriculum here at Kaya Association, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Jane Bach and Sue Brake to talk more about total portfolio approach, and particularly the implementation and what it means to work at an organization that employs the TPA model. And so with that, I'd love to take an opportunity to introduce my two fantastic guests today, Jane and Sue. Jane, why don't we start off with you? Give us just a little bit of a sense as to your background and your work that you've done so far with TPA.
Thanks, Steve. So I've been with WTW for close to 24 years, starting off in Korea, actually as an organizational consultant. And I think that gave me a good appreciation for governance-related issues. I then moved into the investment side of our business from about 2006 and have taken, I guess, different roles throughout my career with the investment team. But primarily being based in Asia, I have had the opportunity to work with large government schemes, pension schemes, and sovereign wealth funds in the region. And that's one of the reasons that I have stumbled across total portfolio approach, because many of the funds that my clients admire are practitioners of TPA.
Fantastic. And Sue, thank you so much for joining us as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background with TPA?
Sure, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor. So most recently, I have been the CIO of the Future Fund, which is a practitioner of the total portfolio approach. Prior to that, in the very early days, I grew up in dealing rooms and investment banking and thrived in the sharp-elbowed, may the best person win cultures, and then came to Sovereign Wealth Fund as one of the architects of New Zealand Super back in the early 2000s, and so was one of the architects of the approach there, which I've since learned to call the total portfolio approach, because I had 2.5 years, 3 years at Willis Towers Watson, and they had done some really good work in terms of looking at the evidence from a number of different organizations who use similar approach and tied it together. So I got to design it at New Zealand Super, and then I got to fly it in earnest during the COVID period at the Future Fund in terms of the total portfolio approach machine that had been built there. And those machines are built for times like that. And it was an absolute privilege to be able to fly it through that period of time.
And so you forgot to see it firsthand working at two different organizations and how the TPA model works. And in a lot of ways, too, I think one of the great advantages of that is one of the things we talk about in our paper is that there isn't necessarily a singular definition per se of TPA. And so you got to kind of see how two different organizations really made it their own. So I look forward to digging into that a little bit as we talk further on this. So with that, maybe I wanted to start off with Jane. And given that from the role that you sat in, you've been able to engage with a whole number of institutional investors, some that use TPA, some that don't, some that transition to TPA. And so just to start off with maybe the first obvious question, can any organization adopt TPA? Is TPA for everyone?
So it's an interesting question, because I think theoretically the answer is yes. That said, I think all of the examples that we see in real life so far have tended to be, larger organizations that are quite well known, reputable. And so you might be thinking, well, that's good for them, but maybe that's not right for me. But if you think of TPA as less of a model and more of a state of mind, then I think the answer is, generally speaking, yes. You can adopt certain elements of it. Think of an individual investor like any of us. It is possible to, instead of thinking about equity returns or fixed income returns, to think about your total return in a more joined up way. Now, that's an extreme example. Most organizations, especially the ones that are considering TPA, are going to have their own in-house teams and will have been running SAA approaches for many years. But I think at least some of the thinking behind TPA is definitely adoptable by any investor, thinking about total returns, thinking about being joined up, thinking about better communication across teams, thinking about risk factors, seeing through returns. I think all of that is eminently doable.
So if a plan came to you and said, "Hey, we're thinking about doing TPA, uh, and we'd love your opinion on that," would there be anything that you would look at that might give you a reason to push back on that decision, or have them think twice about whether or not it was right for them to transition to TPA?
I think that my view on this is very similar to Jane's. In practice, I haven't seen anyone really drive the model without a sophisticated and complex portfolio, and therefore without good risk systems. And it really does fly when you have all of those things. But I do think there are versions of it, and it's not a half pregnant thing. You don't have to be all or nothing. You can take aspects of it that will improve things. But I think the key thing, or the place to start, if an organisation is really keen, is the investment governance, because it is likely to end in more complexity once you start thinking about, you put the total portfolio objective in the centre of every investment decision, which is essentially what a TPA is. Then the risks of not achieving that investment objective is also central to the process. And then you see all these risks, and you want to be able to manage these risks. And there are ways to manage those risks very cost effectively. I'm a very big fan, but it requires complexity. And Roger Irwin, who's the foremost expert on investment governance, will tell you that you shouldn't run a more complex portfolio without having the appropriate investment governance. So it really starts there, and the preparedness to really look at investment governance and make sure that you've got all the bits and pieces there, if you want to run it in earnest in terms of the complexity that comes.
Maybe just to add a thought there, Steve, I think really it is about trying to solve for investment complexity and decision making. The reason that somebody would consider doing this, I think, is because of that governance angle. If everything is hunky dory and everything's working fine, and you are absolutely happy with your program, you don't need, I guess, a higher plane of governance, then maybe it isn't right for you. But I do think that most of the funds that are contemplating this transition are doing it for those governance reasons, because they believe it's a better way to manage complexity that they're facing.
And so to that point, I think you both highlighted really interesting factors about things that may need to be in place to do that transition. Jane, you talked about being able to look at risk factors and have a lot of good ability to analyze portfolios successfully. You both highlighted governance as factors, and so what that leads me to in thinking then is with kind of looking at those elements. Maybe you could speak to a little bit. I'll start with you, Jane. What needs to be in place to be successful in this transition? And you both highlighted governance, so it sounds like that's something that needs to be kind of a day one conversation. But maybe you could kind of chat a little bit more about what are some of the first things you need to look at as an organization to start the successful transition into TPA.
So I think there's sort of hardware as well as software to think about here, but maybe hardware is easier. Sue alluded to the need for risk systems. I think oftentimes I see this transition in thinking happen when a fund is actually focusing less on return and more on risk. So it's the question about, are you trying to maximize return, or are you trying to minimize the risk of failure? The systems and the investment that's required to be able to do that to a higher degree are quite significant. And if you don't have even that, maybe the thought won't even occur to you. But I think it's when you have that clarity of seeing the risks that are in the portfolio that you potentially start thinking about how they impacted that total portfolio. So it happens almost naturally. I'm not saying it's a prerequisite though. So maybe that's just one example on the hardware side. You would also need a strategy team that is a little bit more open to thinking about that as well, rather than the old mold of just here's the SAA, we do it every 3 years, and everybody just needs to follow this, and then we just manage within these bands. So it needs you need a strategy function that is going to be able to do more than just that. On the software side, I'd say a couple of things. Winning hearts and minds is quite important. So I think two things. You would need to have a belief that the current system is not the best for whatever reason, or that the current arrangement is not working. I think you would also need some element of willing leadership. Leaders can also be led to some degree or influenced, but I think you also need basically support, sponsorship from somebody at the top, desire from the top as well for betterment. And I think, because I think I've mentioned this before on the paper that we wrote together, but it's going to take a while to make these types of changes. So you need the ability to handle delayed gratification. That would be what I'd say for the hard and the soft side.
And Sue, you talked about governance. So I'm imagining then it probably, and Jane just mentioned this, it probably takes some conviction from the leadership to conduct the transition in a successful and smooth way. But also at the board level too, I'd imagine that you really need to have buy-in from the board, which could result in a very meaningful change in how the board operates and engages with the plan. So I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit in terms of what you need out of the board in order to have a successful transition into TPA.
Yeah, again, I completely agree with Jane. I think the three factors that she mentioned there were the same three: the leadership, the systems, and the culture. But the culture at the board is really important, and I would say that the starting point is, unless you've got an enthusiastic chairperson, I would question the hard road you're going to be having to try and get there, because it is really a transformational change. It's a big change, and a lot of the investment cultures around the world they value fundamental analysis, whites of the eye, smarter than the next guy, sort of alpha chasing. That's what investment is. That's their model for investors, and that's their model for a good investor, and that's their model for a good investment leader. And so for that kind of organization to make this change is quite challenging. So you would need to have a chair who really gets it and really wants to go there, and really believes in the additional. It's not only about risk mitigation. There's plenty of evidence and plenty of audiences that you speak to who agree that there is extra return as well as lower risk. You're greatly improving the Sharpe, but you're also able to harness extra return. And I think the unwavering belief in that and the governance work are going to be essential before you start, because change fatigue is very real in these projects, and that commitment to it is important. But again, my experiences with very large, very sophisticated funds, there will be a simpler version of that. If people bear in mind that that's where my experience is speaking from.
Jane, there might be a bit of a chicken and an egg question here, but just in practicality, where do you start? Do you start with rewriting your governance? Do you start with building out systems to be able to collect all the information that you need? What is the very first step, meaningful step that an organization would take to move in the direction?
I think as with any change initiative, the first step that often happens is a recognition of, some of the shortcomings of the current system. It's a diagnosis, essentially. I think the impetus for change comes from a place of recognizing why you need to change. And so I know that sounds quite conceptual, and it's not as if everybody just does some kind of diagnostic, right? But when I look at where people start, it's as with any human endeavor, it starts by focusing on fixing problems. All right. So you have to recognize what those problems are first. Then, as you seek other ways to solve those problems and you start talking to your peers, that's where the idea for, okay, there's another way to approach this, I think, comes. But, oftentimes it doesn't start from, hey, I've come up with a cleverer model, or shouldn't we just revamp our compensation system? It usually doesn't happen that way. It really is about fixing a specific problem. In some funds cases, that will be more of a governance problem. In other cases, it might be an agility problem. But what we have found is that TPA does tend to lend itself well to many of those problems. At the end of the day, investment is a people business. And so the problems that we're trying to solve for are people related in most cases. So I'd say you start from a place of what is working and what's not working. And if some of the things that are not working are things that can be addressed through TPA, then I think you start researching that, and looking at which elements are right for you. I'm not sure that I fully squared the question that you're trying to ask, because I know a lot of people want the quick fix. Just give me step number one. I don't really have that for you, Steve. I think everybody has started from a slightly different place.
Well, that makes sense to me. And I think that what I'm really hearing you talk about is an organizational embrace. And that's something that I think really we discussed in our paper and sort of permeated throughout that, is that it's something that is there's a culture element to it, and you want to have sort of that teamed up, joined up approach. And so, Sue, following on with that, I guess one of the things that I'm curious about, but in transitioning to TPA, I'm guessing that there's a chance that you might have some turnover in employment, because maybe the model isn't right for everybody. Is that something that you experience, that for TPA to be successful, you need to basically have a full team embrace of it? And if there are folks who can't get behind it, that they might be better suited to be somewhere else?
I think the answer to that is probably. I think the biggest personal impact of working in a TPA environment is the autonomy. The SAA, where someone decides on the SAA and they can do that with autonomy, and then someone decides on their piece of it and how they're going to engage, and they can do that autonomously. That, I think it's Dan Pink that said that's one of the, basic needs of people being met when they work. They need autonomy. So you need to be really conscious of cutting across autonomy when you're trying to bring every decision being made cognizant of what you're trying to achieve. And so the people who enjoy that are the ones that love working in high performance teams, are purpose driven, love doing something really, really well for the client. But if you are very high in autonomy, you're going to hate it. You're going to hate it. So I think I've been through the transformation now 4 times, and 4 times in depth, multi-year, and I've gotten better at it in terms of being able to warn people about some of these things, and so the pain is less. But the very first one was very painful, very painful. So I think, get some advice before you start off, so that you're aware of where those pain points are, and do it in a way that is going to suit the organization you have. There are some organizations who have made a very successful model out of not doing TPA. They have siloed or in parallel investment streams that are all, like a mini model of capitalism and innovation, are all out there doing something amazing, and the best ones will survive. And in my experience, I don't know any asset owners that works particularly well with, and someone will write in and tell me where I'm wrong. But with asset managers, that works well, because an asset manager objective is to beat a benchmark, whereas an asset owner is to achieve something with a total portfolio. And that's where the TPA is best suited. Gosh, I hope I'm not putting people off, Stephen, because I really do think it is a wonderful journey, but it has a people and culture element that's really, intrinsic to it.
But I think really, Sue, you touched on the key difference, right? We can just be as good as any asset manager. We'll just hire the same people, pay them about the same, but maybe give them more purpose. I'm not sure exactly what the logic might be, but I think you have had a lot of asset owners that have been trying to emulate the asset management, world. But at the end of the day, they're very different in terms of the underlying nature. As you say, as an asset owner, you have a singular purpose, and there's a reason for being. For an asset manager, you have to basically be the absolute best you can be for many different clients with many different purposes, right? So I think, touching on that also helps to understand why we might see this, or it's a little bit more prevalent potentially within the asset owner space.
And Sue, to follow up on your comment, if I'm a professional in the industry and either my firm that I'm working for is switching over to TPA, or I'm looking for opportunity and maybe a firm that employs TPA has the job that I'm looking at, you already mentioned the comment about autonomy. If you're someone who really values autonomy or thrives on autonomy, maybe the TPA model isn't right for you. What else should a professional know about before joining a TPA organization or thinking about joining a TPA organization to make sure that it's the right fit for them?
I think that thing we all say we have, but when we're being self-honest, maybe none of us are particularly good at it. It's certainly the older we get, and that curiosity and humility about different ways of doing things. The longer you do something a certain way, the more codified it becomes in your DNA. And it's just very hard for you to imagine, because you've seen all the reasons why it's the right way to do it. And it's quite hard to change. But if you love an approach that is always open to what might be the best thing to put in the portfolio, rather than turning the handle on the process, because that is very nimble. It's more dynamic. TPA is more dynamic than SAA. And it's, for a boffin like me, I love thinking across a broad range of particular types of investments that will suit a particular need that we have. So the Future Fund, who I adore, through the COVID period, everyone had been in training for these kinds of crises with this kind of model. And it was this incredible, here's the pivot we want to make. We did a really big shift at that time in terms of, this is the marking point of the new world, and we need to be, more aware of inflation, more aware of deglobalization, more aware of politicization, geopolitical risk, etc. And so we made a number of, just describe them as attributes that we needed in the portfolio, and each of those asset class teams would go out and club something over their head and bring it back and go, this, and the group would say, yeah, that's what we want. And now that we've got this, we really want that. And yes, that comes with some things that we don't want, but we can either neutralize it with this, or we can hedge it with that. And it's this, for people who enjoy that big picture thinking, it was exhilarating. It does bring better outcomes. And in both the organisations I've worked at, Future Fund and New Zealand Super, the dynamism, they're both very dynamic portfolios, has reduced risk and added, one of them reduced risk, but added a huge amount of return by being dynamic at the total portfolio level.
I'm just imagining all the engineers coming together after Apollo 13 and trying to fangle something up with whatever is available. But yeah, the way I'd express it maybe is that if you are one of those people that doesn't like a lot of change and likes to be, to have visibility on what you're going to do day to day, which is not a crime at all. That's definitely something that a lot of us, I think, aspire to actually. To be, a professional at the top or the pinnacle of your field, and not to have to deal with other annoyances outside of your particular area of speciality, right? There are many organizations that will allow you to do that, whether that's in the asset management field or within the asset owner field. I think there is a level of vulnerability that you are opening yourself up to by adopting TPA because it does require curiosity, openness, and a learning culture. It requires you to be wrong at times and for another asset class team to be more right for the portfolio at a given point in time. And, that takes humility to actually say, actually, I'm not good for the portfolio right now. Takes, I think, a bit of courage as well as vulnerability. So, fostering that type of culture is very different. You can't take it. You can't take these metaphors too far. At the end of the day, we're not that different. And if you meet somebody at either of these types of organizations, you'll find that they're actually not that different in what they're doing day to day. But it is one of those subtle organizational things where you are encouraging or enabling that curiosity and openness to actually add value.
Jane, I appreciate your comment that it's that not that we're splitting hairs by any means, but there's not the differences might feel a little bit subtle in some ways from a day-to-day standpoint for the different types of models. And so, but with that, Sue, I want to kind of ask the same question, but in a slightly different way, which would be, you hired people into your organization, so you were looking for investment professionals, and I'm assuming that you were looking for certain qualities or characteristics that maybe an SAA investor wasn't necessarily focusing on or as prioritizing as much as maybe you did. And so I'm kind of curious, what were some of those elements that maybe you think that someone working for a TPA organization emphasizes a bit more when they're interviewing and seeking investment professionals to join their firm?
Firstly, I would say it still needs deep asset class expertise. You don't want an organization of generalists. People who are excited about cross asset class. You need the expertise. You're investing a very large, very complex portfolio, and you need people to know what they're doing. I think with both the organizations I worked for, once you get to the point where the total portfolio is in the DNA, you can focus more on the expertise and less on the fit with the culture, because that person won't get away with it. They won't be able to drag the organization back into a silo, because it'll feel weird. It does feel weird to them. They go, "What is this place?" And so you can then it's quite hard to find those people who are deep expertise, but also still young enough in their brain to be able to think curiously and think differently. It's a very, very difficult skill to find. So it's a slow and painful process getting the culture to that point, and all the other things that you can do in an organization to get the culture there. The Future Fund have set up a Future Fund Academy that is all about making sure that kind of culture is maintained. But initially you do have to be very, very careful about the kinds of people that you're bringing in without compromising the asset class expertise or SAA expertise, if that's what it is that you're looking for.
And Jane, when you were working with firms that were making the transition, did you see them going out and changing who they were hiring or how they hired? Did something change in that part of the process at all in terms of the people that they were bringing into the organization?
I don't think I saw it up to that degree. I think most of their energy was focused on actually getting their own people on board. So if I'm honest with you, did I get to see the part where they were like, okay, we're all settled internally and now, we can focus. I'm sure they did. But a lot of the energy, I think, is actually spent, as I said before, on shifting hearts and minds of your existing people who have worked in a certain way for a long time. And that is, that requires a fair bit of energy. But over time, gradually, yes, you hire the people that are a good fit culturally for your organization. That will never change. Even when you were, maybe more of a policy portfolio SAA type of investor, you would still be hiring people who are a right fit for the culture. It's just that your culture is shifting. So I don't think that would ever change. I think all asset owners will be focusing quite a lot on cultural fit when they're hiring. But in terms of somebody who has fully embraced the TPA approach, you're probably going to put a slightly higher credence on things like communication, some degree of maybe multi-asset capability. I mean, what I saw for a lot of the organizations who were early adopters of TPA, um, around about, say, right after the financial crisis, there was a visible increase in the number of strategy people on the team as compared to previously. So there was, I guess, a recognition that there was a need for more strategy expertise to be able to navigate, the world that we were in. I also noticed that they were hiring bankers, from risk people from previously from banks. Not all of them necessarily, but there was definitely a move away from just pure relative risk, which was kind of the mantra at the time, to the need to bring in some absolute risk expertise as well. And also build, within the strategy team, build up almost like an investment risk function. You know how the risk team needs to be somewhat segregated and, separate reporting line, best practice, all of that. But one of the things I noticed was that there was a greater emphasis on investment risk. And oftentimes those investment risk people were actually working very directly with the asset class teams. And I think that there was a period of education going on where these, new experts were actually helping the organization understand, the risks that were running through what used to be considered siloed asset classes. So, that's just one example how, we are creatures of our environment. And I think, that particular shock to the system did result in the models that we see today. As the way we've coped with those types of crises has actually given birth to a stronger model, in my view, through TPA.
I would strongly endorse that, Jane. I completely agree. After we were midway through an SAA review during the global financial crisis and as an asset allocation team, and that's when we pivoted to this reference portfolio concept with a total portfolio approach. Again, we didn't call it that. And then it was really COVID, at the Future Fund. Again, we were midway through an analysis that made us pivot. So it's that learning, that learning about what really is important. But, the whole premise of the total portfolio approach is it's right at the center of every decision and of your processes. So I agree. I think it really came in earnest after the GFC, that this idea of thinking about it differently. And in my experience, I'll be honest, we stole the concepts from the Canadians. So I think that was probably the birthplace of the thinking. Yeah.
So, Sue, one other thing I wanted to pick your brain on, a lot of this conversation feels like when we're talking about it in terms of implementing and transitioning, that it really is something that's going to be driven by, the CIO, the board, other senior professionals in the organization. If I'm a little bit lower down on the org chart, if I'm a more junior professional, what is my role in a successful TPA? What can I do to encourage my firm to transition there? Or when I'm in a firm like that, what role do I play? What part do I play in all of this?
I mean, I think there's a lot. I really do believe that leaders are in all, seniorities of an organization. I believe in hierarchies. And so there's a lot you can do to influence the culture by raising risks that are not being addressed, by implementing it in your own area in terms of just constantly being that person that brings up what are we trying to do here, by shortcomings in the governance, because that is often where these things start, and just being it's harder as a junior person, and I agree. I admit that I was in my 30s, I think, before I was brave enough to stick my neck out. I now wished I'd done it earlier, and I encourage people. Everybody has value to add to the conversation. It took me a while to realize that by being wrong, which is what I was so frightened of, I was adding value, because now the group could go, that's stupid, and they could move on to something that was going to end them in the right place. So it took me a while to consciously make that decision, but be brave and say what you see. I think that it has a profound impact on culture to have more and more people doing that.
Maybe to add, Steve, for at least for what I've seen from Asia, because Asia does tend to be a little bit more top down than bottom up, but At the same time, that top down piece is oftentimes a rotating one where it's not 10-year terms, but 2 or 3 year terms. And so the layer that's immediately below the top management is actually in some ways longer standing and more influential in a lot of these Asian funds. Um, but one of the things that I've noticed and the way I've seen it sort of percolate through some of the Asian funds that I work with is actually peer benchmarking. Um, there are a lot of large funds out there that Asia funds wish to emulate. Many of them are within very sort of strict SA type frameworks where they lack flexibility and dynamism. And when they go and talk to their peers, they are sometimes shocked to hear different ways of doing things. I can give you two examples of two different peer studies I did. One where we were speaking to Future Fund, it was David Neal at the time. And my client was completely blown away by the fact that there were no department related bonuses. Now that might have changed since then. This was a long time ago, and Sue can tell me. But at the time, David was basically explaining we have a total fund approach, and so the bonus is basically based off of the total fund results and your individual KPIs, and that's it. No departmental bonuses, no pool of money for the equity team versus the fixed income team. And the client was so shocked because they hadn't envisioned that that was even possible. Another simple sort of example was when we visited CPPIB's real estate team, and the client actually asked because they couldn't actually believe that this could work in practice. So in a year where it's unfavorable for you to deploy anything into real estate and you don't pull the trigger, you would still get a bonus. And the answer to that was yes, absolutely. And that completely shocked the client as well, a different client. But it's things like this that they bring back and they learn from over the years, and you go back again and the answer hasn't changed. And the results, you see the results over time. And I think that has influenced. So, just speaking and learning from others, I think, is another way that this happens.
So one thing we haven't talked about really is risks. And I think that some folks can maybe imagine some of the risks. There's implementation risks, execution risks, and so forth. But maybe I'll start with you, Sue. Would be, are there any unintended or unexpected risks that a firm or organization might have in transitioning to TPA?
I mean, there's again, the complexity doesn't have to come with it, but obviously there are risks around complexity, and the governance is really important. And a specific element of that governance is a disciplined investment approach. Because if you take the SAA asset classes away and the ranges around which they can move, and you allow the whole portfolio to move dynamically, you could really get that wrong if you haven't thought carefully about what gives you confidence, what kinds of building blocks, as I call them, once you get rid of asset classes that can be all manner of things. What makes sense? What do I have the most confidence in? And a risk budgeting exercise that's very thoughtful about that. Because if you if you leave it to a small group of people to react, you'll get those usual human biases of fear and greed and, all those other things we know we're capable of. So I think the portfolio construction and the investment decision making, it's all part of good governance. It needs to be very clearly articulated. And then the bigger risk, even than that, is the not bringing people along. The cultural thing can be extremely painful if you haven't, and painful to the point of collapse, i.e. it's not to be sniffed at. Like it needs to be very well managed.
I was thinking similar things actually, Sue, because in some ways you might say, oh, I've been in this straitjacket all this time and suddenly you're giving me, freedom to do it. And, that additional flexibility, I guess, if you're at the board level and you're looking at it, you're afraid that that might be abused, right? And so the investment discipline in place and the level of trust between, management and the board is going to be quite key. In fact, I think I was struck by what Charles Hyde said, that it was a constant and ongoing effort. that, and I sort of see that as like an exercise regime. Once you decide I'm going to be more healthy, and I'm going to, just generally be taking better care of myself. Well, if you stop doing it at any point, it's not going to work, right? So you have to be constantly working through a program. And I think a lot of that board dynamic and management dynamic and trust is, akin to that. One other thing that I have seen with, maybe this is more of an Asia thing, is that the strategy team, oh, this is something for the strategy team, which we are going to rename the total portfolio management team or the total portfolio approach team, and they will take care of it. And I can just do my day job and not worry about it because, anything that falls through the cracks, the strategy team will do something to manage the risk. So I think one of the risks is that you don't, as Sue was mentioning, you don't bring people along, you allow them to keep their silos, and somebody else is going to fix it. It's somebody else's problem. Maybe that is also another potential area of risk in terms of making this transition.
Just adding to the delegation issue, it's a really important point. And in my experience, what it looks like in terms of that transparency, it's a one-pager description and a half of the framework by which you're making the decisions. And the framework is very based in competitive advantage and why you can have high confidence in this. So instead of it being this big process document or this really tight no delegation, there's this constant refresh and discussion with the board of the framework by which these decisions are being made and why, and the disciplines and why the board can have confidence that they're good investment decisions.
So you both have been very generous with your time, and so I want to be very mindful of that. And so where I'd like to conclude with is there's a lot of we don't know what we don't know, especially for myself. I don't in this topic, and you're both much more expert on this than I could ever hope to be. And so I'd love to kind of end with giving you both just an opportunity for any closing remarks on things that people should be thinking about, whether they're exploring transitioning their firm to TPA or they're looking into joining a firm that utilizes the TPA model, and just kind of your final thoughts or closing thoughts on either or both of those points. So maybe Jane, we'll start with you and allow you to kind of give any concluding thoughts that you might have for this conversation.
I'm going to keep it short, Steve. Any change that's worth doing is going to be difficult, but absolutely worth it. So I would encourage anybody who is considering it, do your homework, do the research, make sure that you understand what you're getting into, but know that there is a reward at the end if you get it right.
Sue, final words?
Again, echoing that, I'm going to ride my hobby horse a little bit. I really do think TPA is essential for diversified management of a portfolio in the current environment where there's been this big increase in, passive investment and these mounting potentially systemic risks of geopolitical tension and how that might manifest in terms of, the reserve currency status. There's just so many, I've never seen in my career more that, I'm not saying they're likely, but they're no longer something that you can ignore. And so to go back to basics and go, what does risk mean for us? And what are we really, I think you have to, in order to be able to navigate the waters that we're in. So strongly recommend thinking about TPA.
Well, Jane, Sue, I'm so delighted to be able to spend the last 45 minutes with you both. I know I learned a lot. I'm so appreciative of you allowing us to continue this conversation and continue to talk about the TPA model and implementation and working there and the challenges that investors may face in terms of thinking about and managing through that transition. So I'm so grateful for your time, and thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks, Sue.